On December 7, 1941, military forces of the Japanese Empire attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Now, that was a disaster for the American military, but just off of Pearl Harbor, an American destroyer called the USS Ward sank a Japanese submarine. The shots were fired by this gun. The Ward's deck gun was staffed by naval reservists from St. Paul, Minnesota, and the deck gun is actually in St. Paul now. It's actually aiming at the Minnesota History Center, which you've already visited in past and presents. We're here, though, at the very south end of the Capitol Mall. So this is St. Paul's state capitol, and we're going to visit some sites that are memorials on the Capitol Mall in this episode of Past and Presents. We'll start a tour of memorials by the state capitol in front of the state capitol. This is the very famous Minnesota state capitol designed by Cass Gilbert. And this is the newest and largest of the war memorials on the Capitol grounds. This is the World War II Veteran Memorial for the state of Minnesota. Over 300,000 Minnesotans served in the Second World War between 1941 and 45, and about 2% of them died in the conflict. You should come visit this for yourself to really take it all in. It's a very spacious memorial with a lot of meaning embedded. Generally, the theme is one of moving from darkness to light, from despair to hope, and you actually get a sense of kind of moving upwards along a plane. You also get these panels around that explain the history of Europe and the Pacific, and the home front as well. You also see that the memorial is surrounded by what's called the Ring of Honor. That has stone plaques representing lots of other wars, Spanish-American, Civil War, World War I, but also specific units, people who were on the Bataan Death March, women who served, Hispanic Minnesotans who served. So there's a lot to explore here if you do come down to the state capitol. I'm interested in memorials partly because there's something both secular and sacred about them. We live in a country that separates church and state, and yet at the same time we do have these very holy places where we celebrate the sacrifice of wartime. And that's maybe as good an entree as we can do to lead into our conversation that will start this week and continue into our next webisode. And that's on how is it that Christians practice history? So this will be an extended conversation with our faculty. We'll have lots to say about this in class as well, and you'll be writing about this. But let's kick it off and go to our first part of our conversation. So in this week's conversation, AnneMarie, Kooistra, and I are going to be wrestling with actually, it's going to take 2 weeks, I think. How do Christians do history? Now,
I'll be wearing the same clothes, but don't let that fool you.
Just it might be two separate filming things. We just might be on a rotation where we wear the same clothes. I might take this off just to think so. In Tracy McKenzie's book, he suggests that the task of a class like this is to help students at a college like Bethel, or in his case, Wheaton, think historically about the past, but also think Christianly about the past. Now, for the most part, we have not necessarily brought faith explicitly into the class at this point, and here we're going to do this. But let me start with this. To what extent is thinking historically about the past and thinking Christianly about the past exactly the same thing?
Well, I think it's very similar in that if you are a good historian, you will engage in the same kinds of practices that a historian engages in. So if I'm doing a good history of prostitution, it's probably going to look very similar in terms of the evidence I use, the secondary sources I use in order to create my piece. So it will look very similar.
I mean, I'll come back to this in our second segment for this week. But a book that I think has really been helpful to me is George Marsden. Marsden's a Reformed historian, taught at Calvin, taught at Notre Dame for a long time, trained a lot of great American religious historians. And he suggested, mostly for a secular audience, you really don't have anything to worry about. We actually play by the rules of the game. And so he talks about the fact that we abide by rules of evidence, and we are seeking to be objective. And a way I sometimes have students think about this, and so I'll frame it as a question to you. If someone were to read an article you've written or a book you're writing about the history of prostitution in California, like 1888, would they know that you were a Christian?
Well, funny you should ask, because I had students in history of sexuality read an article that I'd written, and I asked, can you tell that I'm a Christian by reading this article? And a lot of them said, if I didn't know you, I wouldn't necessarily be able to tell, except that a couple of very perceptive students, I thought, noted that I don't necessarily have the sort of celebratory tone that some of the historians who look at this have. Instead of saying, oh, let's just look for agency on the part of these women who are, fighting the system by using the system's parameters against the system. I'm more willing to say, this was not a great system for women, and sort of acknowledge that they weren't just agents.
Okay, and now actually I want to come back to that maybe in the second half of this, because I think it is one place where Marston, for example, does say there might be some assumptions you want to push back against on the basis of your faith.
Right, and most students did not notice a very discernible
It's very
Christian.
subtle.
Yes, it's very subtle,
Yeah.
and I do that deliberately, actually.
It could vary by field too.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, the nature of the history I've done recently, as opposed to my graduate training of diplomatic history.
Right.
Like, I mean, if you had read articles I did in grad school or my first couple years,
Right.
you would, I don't know if you'd ever think.
No.
When I've done book reviews, the one place that might slip in is like I've reviewed books about the Cold War, and I suggest maybe you're not being attentive enough to religion.
Right.
And maybe you don't know what to do with those
Right.
categories. But I mean, it might be a little different if you're doing the history of Christianity, and that's
Right.
really tricky. And I'm not trained as this, but talking to some evangelical historians who do evangelicalism, on the one hand, they want to be detached.
Right.
They want to do the best
Right.
quality work they can. They want to be respected within their guild. I think they also have at least some sense they're doing it for the church.
Right.
It's at least a helpful criticism
Right.
for fellow evangelicals.
Right.
So when I do like history of Bethel and history of pietism, I sometimes feel like I'm getting into that area, which can be tricky.
Right, but it's also, interesting to know, and I think George Marsden has acknowledged this, I'm not sure in this piece, but in another one, that one of the best historians of Puritan New England is actually a non-Christian. So,
Scary stuff.
no, it's Percy.
Yeah, okay.
So anyway.
So an atheist could write the history of Puritanism.
And
right?
do it very well,
Right.
even if he's maybe not as attuned to certain sort of facets of the Puritan culture. So you're not necessarily a Christian because you're doing Christian history.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I actually just read a piece by the president of Wesleyan University in Connecticut, who's an intellectual historian. He describes himself as a atheist secular Jew. He has a kind of
right.
cultural components. But he wrote this piece for the Wall Street Journal last week talking about bringing religious questions into his intellectual
Right.
history classroom and asking people, don't just tell me what original sin
Right.
means in Christian theology, but how would it feel to be a Protestant
Right.
in the 16th
Right,
century?
right.
And he says that he thinks it's a really important question to ask, not to convert
Right.
these students, but to develop empathy and
Right.
to help them take these people on their own terms. But his students are really uncomfortable with it,
Right.
including those who are Christian,
Right.
because it's a very hard thing to talk about in the kind of secular marketplace of ideas sometimes.
Well, and what's also sometimes challenging for Christian students who are learning about history is to sort of expose them to this idea that the Christians they read about from, say, 17th century American history are very different in their articulation of the faith. They read Mary Rowlandson, for example, and she's writing about Native Americans, and they're like, whoa, this, God the Father business, this, retribution business, this wrath, that's very weird, for them to read that is in fact a fellow traveler.
A takeaway I hope from the class is how much literature can inform our understanding of an experience, of an era. It tends to be not a primary source we look to help us understand what it means to be American. But for example, like Herman Melville in Moby Dick, and again, we don't read the whole thing. We read just selections from that, but surprisingly to students, he has a lot to say about race, and a lot to say about class, and a lot to say about gender identity, and about relationships between men and women in Moby Dick. So that's a great place that we get to look at. Mark Twain is really fun to read. He's a humorist, but he kind of like stares us down and makes us think about questions that would be hard for me to get at in using other types of primary sources. We use Edith Wharton, who writes about the upper class, and so that's really fun to look at as well. I think how much students today have in common with 19th century Americans, I don't know if that surprises them, but maybe that's a comfort in a way. Issues about gender and identity, issues about what it means to be a man or a woman, class issues, religious issues, economic issues, they're all there. And again, Americans were approaching their problems in different ways and coming to different conclusions.
We're now at the Korean War Memorial for the state of Minnesota. This is just a little bit east of the World War II Memorial on the state capitol grounds. This is dedicated in 1998, and in many ways it's my favorite, I think the most interesting memorial. The Korean War is kind of this forgotten war, but almost 100,000 Minnesotans served in it between 1950 and 1953, and almost 1,000 of them were either killed or went missing in action. Another 1,500 were wounded. So you got this really interesting sculpture of a young GI who's been separated from his platoon, is kind of lost in the wilderness, gazing off. And if you read the inscription, it talks about him having grown too old too quickly, and suggests some of the haunted nature of the soldier's experience in a war like Korea. We'll come back and look at a couple more memorials later on.
I am a Bethel graduate, 1988.
I'm a 1999 Bethel grad.
I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy.
I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross.
Mutuality editor and publications coordinator.
I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice.
English Language Institute, China, in China.
Library director at the College of St. Scholastica.
I'm a history professor at Bethel University.
I was a history major.
I was a Bethel history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
History major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
My name's Annie Sjoholm. I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy. I teach 6th and 7th grade, and I was a history major at Bethel University. I have a lot of teachers in my family, and so that was something I could always easily see myself doing. I love kids, and so that was always really natural. But also I had a high school AP American history teacher that was just an amazing teacher. He was the one who really taught me how to write, and I loved his class. We had amazing discussions. And so when I decided to major in history, it was always with the idea that I was going to be a teacher as well. I would say I am so thankful that I have the double major in history. I think it has helped me so much to be able to know what I'm talking about in the classroom, and I would recommend anyone who's majoring in social studies education to either get a double major and along with that take as many classes as possible in the content area. So take high-level econ, take political science, take a variety of geography courses and history courses that cover all throughout the world, not just one specific area, because in social studies you can end up teaching so many different areas. I would also say while you are in class, engage in that class so much. Your professors have an amazing ideas that you may end up using one day in your social studies classroom. Keep up with current events, ask questions, read The Economist, do anything you can, because that's what your life is going to be like as a social studies teacher. It's going to be constantly researching, constantly finding resources, and constantly making connections. So as much as you can do it now. I loved all my classes in my history major. It was amazing discussion. I learned how to write really well. I learned how to present. One class that really stands out to me is Dr. Kooistra's History of the American West. It was just a lot of fun, and I just loved the topics. I loved how engaging she was as a teacher. I still to this day reflect how she handled that class and how I can be like that in my own classroom. And then I also remember the textbooks, the major problems in history textbook. I thought those were great. They had a bunch of primary sources, and then they had essays by historians, and I thought those models really helped me to become a stronger writer myself, and I still go back to those and look at the primary sources and sometimes use some of them in my class today. I'm sort of an atypical person because I was a double major in education and social studies. My senior year in college, it became very clear to me that I wanted to teach in more of a high poverty area, and I had a couple of friends who've done Teach for America, and they talked about how you get the support in the classroom even once you get the job, and you get specific support to the students and the community that you're teaching to. And so I just felt like the more preparation I could have, the better, and the more support that I could have, and so that's the reason I went forward with Teach for America. I think what I learned from my Teach for America experience is similar to what any new teacher learns. I learned how to persevere in a variety of situations. I learned how to have confidence in myself in front of a group of students, and then I also learned the importance of humility. I love my job. I love that I get to get paid for researching and staying up to date with history. I love that I get to plan these enriching lessons. I love building the relationships with the kids and the students. Yeah, I seriously think I have the best job in the world.
What's most surprising is the variety of people that they meet in American Civ, because they're used to American history in the high school, and for a lot of people still, for whatever reason, and I know this is changing, there's still maybe a lot of dates, a lot of wars, a great men of history approach in the history in high schools. So in college, when they're reading about Puritan America through the eyes of Anne Hutchinson, who's on trial for, is it her gender? Is it her religious beliefs? They're like, whoa, this is actually a lot more interesting than we thought history was back in high school. And I get it in a way I didn't get in high school. We look at that period through primary sources. And so the textbook that we're using offers, for example, a glimpse into the Civil War from the perspective of nurses, and also indicates that this was then an entry point of women into the profession of nursing after the Civil War, and in a way that it wasn't available to them prior to the Civil War. The Boston Massacre topic, that's been a consistent one that we've been talking about through the years. And students sort of think that they know what that was, and it's, rah, rah, America, and, those terrible British, they massacred us. And then they read through the court transcripts, the depositions from the people who were there, and they realize, okay, this was a little bit more complex, and maybe those Americans shouldn't have thrown the snowballs and enticed the British to fire upon them, and maybe this is a little bit different than what we thought, and there's a little more sympathy for the British and for the complexity of the situation. That's usually plus we often will reenact that based on the descriptions of the depositions, and that's fun too.
This is the Minnesota Vietnam Veterans Memorial. This was dedicated in 1992, and at first glance it's somewhat evocative of Maya Lin's famous memorial in Washington, D.C. It's very stark as you look at the Roll of Honor with the quotation from the poet Archibald MacLeish. 68,000 Minnesotans served in the Vietnam War. 1,100 of them died, and that's actually integrated into the memorial in a really interesting way. If you look at the floor of the space, you'll find 68,000 little square tiles, and 1,100 of them are colored green and scattered around to indicate the degree of which Minnesotans lost their lives or went missing in action. Vietnam, of course, is this deeply controversial war. Even in 1992, there were some deep wounds there. And if you read the history of this memorial, you get the sense that they wanted to be as apolitical as possible. They actually said at the first dedication ceremony, we're not trying to resolve political disputes, we just want to remember. And the chief way they tried to do this was through conjuring the notion of coming home. A really interesting part of the memorial is this cutout of a house with a window. You imagine the mom looking out, or the dad looking out, waiting for their son or their daughter to come home. There are also a lot of Minnesota trees. There's this kind of calm body of water, just very gently bubbling. And so it's meant to be this very peaceful, anodyne kind of feeling. Okay, let's continue our conversation now about how Christians do history. Again, this will be a 2-week conversation because there's a lot for us to deal with here, and you'll be adding your own perspective in one of your essays for the course as well.
So, AnneMarie, let me go back to George Marsden. I've alluded to this book called The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. So let me read you a little bit here, and I think this will pick up what we talked about the first segment, but then push it forward to ask what difference faith would make. So he says, in the corridors of the pragmatic academy, Christians and non-Christians can readily share basic standards of evidence and argument. I mean, as you said, in many respects, we play by the same rules. He says, the fact is, explicitly Christian convictions do not very often have substantial impact on the techniques used in academic detective work, which make up the bulk of the technical scientific side of academic inquiry. Christians, just as other scholars, must employ the requisite degree of detachment in order to weigh evidence judiciously, et cetera, et cetera. It might be objected, however, that if Christian scholarship involves anything that makes it distinctive beyond such technical knowledge, it will violate rules essential to the mainstream academy in just those respects. So I just want to kind of leave off there because that's something we'll come back to next week. There are ways you could do distinctively Christian history that would really make those rules difficult, and so we'll talk about providential history next week. Can you use, for example, special revelation as a source if you're a Christian historian? So I'll just plant that and we'll come back to it. Are there ways, though, that Christian faith or practice or religious imagination or participation in church can shape the way we do history that don't necessarily violate the rules of the secular academy? What difference could it make that maybe our non-Christian colleagues would not notice or maybe appreciate, actually, or to enrich our practice of the discipline?
I think one of the things that I was very much immersed in during my education as even a high school student and then again as a college student is this idea that everybody has a worldview. Some people have a Christian worldview. Theoretically, Christians have a Christian worldview. But, even if you're not a Christian, you have a certain way that you see the world, and that's going to impact how you interpret this evidence and these secondary sources that you use. So I think there's a way that as Christians, our worldview impacts how we see that evidence and how we put it together, so that even if it is still playing by the rules and is still really good, legitimate history, it's okay to acknowledge that you, in fact, do see the world in a certain way, and that's impacted how you put that stuff together. So, I think I do not study prostitution and go, yes, women are experiencing the sexual revolution and making the most of it, and golly gee, that's fantastic. I really see this as, wow, this is a pretty cruddy situation, and a lot of people are implicated in what is happening, and I will be faithful to the women and say, here they are exerting agency, but the larger picture is one that I wish didn't exist.
I think, so to start with your first point is really important, which is it's not like Christians are the only ones who wrestle with this. I guess I would hope that secularist historians and Jewish historians, all are wrestling with the fact that there's no view from nowhere. I think here's where, I don't know, students, if you've encountered postmodernism yet, but the sense that all knowledge is embedded in something, that actually does matter.
And atheism is in itself a kind of religious viewpoint, even if it happens to contrast with a different Christian.
So, one thing Marsden is arguing for is the reason we play by the rules of the game, because to an extent that is sacrificing a way of doing history, is that it gains us admission to, he called it the pragmatic or the plural academy. He has this image from, I think, William James of it. It's like a hotel corridor. We all have our special rooms where maybe we talk differently, but in the corridor, it's got to be a shared space. So, but in those rooms, we are reflecting on how our beliefs do shape us. And so in your case, history of prostitution does maybe lend you a different vantage point.
And I don't want to cede the corridor or the rooms to just non-Christian historians who are comfortable, writing about the sort of darker side of sexuality. I want to be part of that conversation, and I don't want to just say, all right, this is somehow more polluted than something else, and therefore we can't touch it, and I'm just going to, do something else. I want to be part of that conversation as another way to maybe bring about a transformative influence.
Yeah, in the chapter students are reading from John Fia, he suggests that one way this might work out is that even within these rules, we keep talking about Christians proceed from certain theological assumptions, or Marsden, borrowing from Nick Wolterstorff, calls them control beliefs. And so one that I think you're kind of getting is the reality of sin, for example. Sophia writes about that. Another is the notion of the Imago Dei from Genesis 1:26-20. All humans are created in the image of God. Sophia has something to say about that. I know that's something you think about, and incarnation probably goes with that. What does that mean for you as a historian of sexuality, prostitution, the United States, or just broadly as a historian?
Well, I'd say, just to use the prostitution example again, I think sometimes, there's a tendency to sort of see prostitutes as so taboo and so off the radar that they don't actually fit into the Imago Dei. And I think it's really important to sort of say, yes, they are made in the image of God, and therefore they do need to have their respect. We need to respect these people. And I think a way to respect them is to understand what is going on and what makes them act the way they do, and understand that they are part of a connected human society. So yeah,
even to tell their story. It's something we talked about maybe when we were doing primary sources. This is just the value of this is what people have left behind, and to do it in a truthful, honest way, that actually is a way of recognizing maybe even that kind of deep sense of dignity and worth that comes from being created in the image of God.
If you're interested in war memorials, let me put a plug in for my class, History 231L, World War II. One of the things we do in that class, beyond talking about commemoration, is we actually visit these memorials and then some other World War I and World War II memorials around the Twin Cities. So you can look for that in even-numbered years. Not all of the memorials on the Capitol Mall are about wars or veterans. This is another of the memorials. There are those for firefighters, first responders, factory workers injured in their jobs. And then this one about the Civil Rights Movement. This is the Roy Wilkins Memorial, called the Spiral for Justice. Roy Wilkins was one of the leaders of the NAACP from the mid-50s to the mid-1970s, a St. Paul journalist who is probably overshadowed by people like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, some of the other heroes of that movement, but played a really important behind-the-scenes role and is a really heroic figure in St. Paul politics. So you can actually see a carving of Roy Wilkins on the other side of that wall. What's interesting about this memorial is that there are 46 different elements representing each of Roy Wilkins' 46 years of service to the civil rights movement. So mostly take this as an encouragement to come down and see the Capitol Mall yourself. We haven't even touched on all the statues of Minnesota politicians. The state capitol itself is really interesting. And just generally, remember that one of the goals of this class is to help us get a sense of how we're present and how location plays a really important role in how we understand what happens in history. We'll be back next week for another episode of Past and Present.
Back, baby, back in time, wanna go back when you were mine. Back, baby, back in time, wanna go back when you